The morning sky was a soft blue when the pilot walked across the runway, his bag swinging lightly at his side. He had flown hundreds of times before, maybe thousands, yet he still looked up at the clouds every morning before takeoff. It wasn't habit, it was love. The sky had always been his place of peace. He felt calm there, away from the noise of the world below. That day was supposed to be a simple flight. A domestic route, only a few hours long, nothing unusual. The passengers were boarding, the crew was checking the seats and luggage, and everything looked routine. But sometimes even an ordinary day can lead to something no one expects. After the plane lifted into the air, the pilot leaned slightly forward in his seat, scanning the horizon. The early sunlight touched the clouds, painting them in gold and silver. It was the kind of sight that made him smile every time. He switched to autopilot for a moment and checked his flight plan again. Everything was smooth. The weather, however, was predicted to change later that afternoon. Light storms over the mountain region they'd be crossing. About an hour into the flight, the calm blue sky started to fade. Thin gray clouds gathered ahead, moving faster than expected. The pilot called air traffic control, confirming turbulence warnings. He adjusted altitude, steering the plane slightly south to avoid the heaviest clouds. The passengers felt only mild bumps, nothing serious. But outside the cockpit, wind brushed against the wings like invisible waves. The pilot's co-pilot cracked a light joke to ease the tension, and both laughed. Still, the pilot kept his eyes sharp. Flying through rough air never scared him, but he respected it. Nature was powerful, always in charge up here. After about 20 minutes, the turbulence softened. The clouds opened slightly, and rays of sunlight poured through like spotlights over the forested mountains below. It was beautiful and quiet. But as the pilot's eyes wandered downward, something unusual caught his attention. Far below, tucked in a deep green valley, a small flash of light blinked. It wasn't steady like sunlight reflecting off water, it was flickering, irregular. He squinted, focusing hard. There it was again. A sharp glint like a signal. The co-pilot noticed his silence and asked if everything was fine. "I'm not sure," the pilot replied, leaning closer.
"Do you see that?"
The co-pilot adjusted his view and nodded slowly. Yeah, could be metal, maybe an old truck or roof. But the pilot wasn't convinced. The light blinked again. 3 short flashes, then a pause. It almost looked intentional, like someone trying to send a message. His chest tightened. He had seen many things from the sky, storms, animals, even boats drifting. But this felt different. He wanted to turn the plane for a closer look, but regulations were strict. They had passengers aboard and safety came first. So instead, he marked the coordinates quietly in his notebook and took one last glance before the mountains disappeared behind clouds. Hours later, when the plane landed safely, everything seemed normal. The passengers thanked the crew, dragging their suitcases out with tired smiles. But the pilot's mind stayed above those mountains. That flickering light, it wouldn't leave him alone. He walked to the flight office and reported his observation to a ground officer. "Probably nothing," he said, trying to sound casual. "But you might want to check this area. Looked like a signal from the ground." The officer nodded politely, wrote down the coordinates, and promised to pass it along. But the pilot knew from experience that sometimes these small notes got lost in paperwork. That night, he went home feeling unsettled. His family greeted him warmly. Dinner was ready, but his thoughts were still somewhere over those forests. He replayed the scene in his mind. The clouds, the sunlight, the blink of light that seemed to be asking for help. Maybe it was just scrap metal or a reflection from an old vehicle. Still, something deep inside told him it wasn't. He sat by the window after everyone went to bed, listening to the quiet hum of the city. Pilots often learn to trust their instruments more than their instincts, but tonight, his heart spoke louder. He picked up his notebook again and stared at the numbers he had written. The coordinates. He opened his laptop, typed them into a map, and zoomed in. The area was remote, surrounded by thick trees and narrow roads. Barely any houses. It was the kind of place where you could disappear easily. He frowned. Why would there be flashing light in such an isolated spot? The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. The next morning, during his pre-flight coffee, he casually mentioned the sighting to a colleague, another pilot he trusted. His friend laughed lightly and said, "Probably a hunter's campfire or some reflection. Don't overthink it." The pilot smiled, but his thoughts stayed heavy. Days turned into weeks. Flights came and went. He saw many sunrises and sunsets from the cockpit, but none brought him peace. The image of that small glimmer still visited him every night. Then one morning, while waiting in the lounge for his next flight, he picked up a newspaper lying on the table. The headline caught his eye. Family missing for months. Search suspended. The story described a family of 3, a couple and their teenage daughter, who had vanished during a road trip through the same mountain area. Their car was never found, and authorities had recently stopped the search. The pilot felt his stomach twist. The region mentioned in the article was exactly where he had seen the flashing light. His fingers trembled slightly as he read the story again. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? He folded the paper and sat still for a long time, lost in thought. He knew it wasn't his job to chase after mysteries, but he couldn't ignore this one. Something inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, that flicker he saw wasn't random. Later that evening, he called the same officer he had spoken to weeks earlier and asked if anyone had checked the coordinates. The officer paused, then admitted that due to weather and limited resources, no follow-up search had been done yet. That was the moment the pilot's heart sank. He realized if he didn't do something, no one might ever know the truth. He looked at his flight log again and quietly planned his next steps. Maybe he could talk to someone from the local rescue department. Maybe he could volunteer to help, or at least share his information directly with someone who cared. That night, lying awake, he thought about the faces in the newspaper, the smiling family before they disappeared. He imagined what might have happened: a car accident on a hidden road, a desperate signal for help, days turning into months. The idea of someone still out there waiting broke him inside. He had seen danger before: storms, emergencies, mechanical failures, but nothing felt like this kind of weight. This was different. This was human. By the time dawn came, his decision was clear. He couldn't just move on and forget it. The light he saw might be someone's last hope, or their memory calling to be found. He packed his small notebook into his flight bag, ready for another routine day. But this time his mission had changed. Every time he looked out the cockpit window, he wasn't just flying anymore. He was searching for answers, for meaning, and maybe for someone who needed him more than he'd ever realize. And deep inside, he made himself a quiet promise. If fate gave him even one more chance to fly over those mountains, he wouldn't just look away. He would find out what that light was, no matter what it took. The pilot couldn't shake the feeling that the light he saw was connected to that missing family. He thought about it constantly, during flights, while driving home, even when trying to sleep. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a strange kind of responsibility pressing against his heart. He told himself it might all be a misunderstanding, but what if it wasn't? What if someone was still out there waiting for help that never came? A few days later, after finishing his morning flight, he drove straight to the local aviation office. He carried the folded newspaper with him and laid it on the officer's desk. "That light I told you about," he said quietly, tapping the printed headline. "This missing family, this is the same area." The officer looked at the map again, unimpressed. "It's possible," he said, "but the region is huge and those mountains are rough. We can't send a team without stronger evidence, probably just debris from an old crash." The pilot tried to stay calm, but disappointment filled his voice. "If it was debris, it wouldn't flash like that. I've been flying for 20 years. I know what sunlight looks like when it hits metal." This was different. It was deliberate. The officer sighed, nodding half-heartedly. "We'll see what we can do." He left the office feeling helpless. It was easier for them to dismiss it than to send people into dangerous terrain. He understood the logic, but not the lack of effort. Sometimes bureaucracy made simple acts of humanity difficult. But that day, the pilot decided he wouldn't stop there. He reached out to an old friend, a volunteer with the Mountain Rescue Association. They'd once worked together during a weather emergency years back. When he explained what he saw, his friend listened more carefully than anyone else had. "That area's been searched before," the rescuer said thoughtfully, "but it's big country and a lot of spots are impossible to reach on foot. Still, if you've got coordinates, I can take a look. Maybe we can fly over it again." That small sentence gave the pilot hope, finally someone who cared enough to help. Over the next few days, he arranged for a private small aircraft through his connections at the airfield. It wasn't an official rescue mission, just a personal initiative. He told his airline he'd be taking some personal leave, then spent hours reviewing flight maps and weather patterns. He marked out the route, checked for air restrictions, and prepared as if it were a normal flight. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This was personal now. The morning of the search came cold and quiet. Mist clung to the valleys and the sun was still climbing above the peaks. The pilot met his rescue friend at the hangar, both carrying thermoses of coffee and maps filled with scribbles. "We'll fly slow and low," the pilot said, "just enough to cover this section. That light came from here, somewhere between these ridges." As they took off, a sense of purpose filled the cockpit. The higher they climbed, the smaller the world below looked. But for the pilot, this flight wasn't about looking down. It was about finding meaning in what he had seen weeks ago. They circled the mountain range for nearly an hour, scanning every ridge and valley. The pilot's eyes darted back and forth, searching for that same flash. The sunlight was brighter now, dancing off rivers and rocks, making it harder to spot anything unusual. Still, he refused to give up. Every glimmer made his heart race, but each one turned out to be nothing. Then, just as his friend was about to suggest turning back, the pilot's hand froze on the controls. "There," he said sharply, pointing ahead. "See that?" The rescuer leaned forward. Through the haze, a faint glint caught the light again, metallic, small, almost hidden by the trees. It was brief but real. They circled lower, keeping a careful altitude. As they banked around the ridge, the sunlight hit it again. This time there was no doubt. Something metallic was buried among the trees, not a reflection from a stream or roof, something larger. They marked the coordinates immediately and radioed the local search unit. "Possible crash site located," the rescuer reported calmly. The pilot's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the controls. His instincts had been right all along. They made a few more passes to capture clear visuals, then turned back toward the base. Neither man spoke for a while. The pilot was lost in thought, part relief and part dread. If that was truly a crash, it meant tragedy. But if it was the missing family's car, at least their mystery could finally have answers. That afternoon, a ground team set out toward the location. The terrain was difficult. Thick trees, uneven rocks, and steep drops that made it nearly impossible to move quickly. The pilot waited near the station, pacing, unable to rest. Hours passed before a radio call finally came through. The voice on the other end sounded heavy. "We found the vehicle," the team leader said quietly. "Looks like it's been here a long time. 2 adult remains inside." The pilot closed his eyes, his chest tightening. He'd hoped for a rescue, not recovery. But the voice continued. "There's something else. We found footprints nearby, fresh ones. Too recent to belong to anyone from years ago." The pilot opened his eyes, his heart suddenly pounding again. "Fresh footprints? You mean someone's alive?" "We don't know," the leader replied. "But it looks that way. We'll expand the search at first light." That night, the pilot couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that someone had survived all this time felt impossible, yet somehow true. He imagined that teenage girl from the article, the daughter who had vanished with her parents. Could she really have survived in those mountains, alone? He stared out his hotel window, watching the stars shimmer above the dark landscape. He thought about fate, how strange and unpredictable it was. A small flash of light from the forest had caught his attention during a routine flight. If he had looked away even for a second, this discovery might never have happened. He wondered how many times in life people missed moments like that, moments that could change everything. The next morning, the pilot joined the rescue team at the base. He wasn't supposed to be there officially, but no one stopped him. Everyone could see the weight on his face. As helicopters lifted off to continue the search, he stood quietly on the tarmac, hoping and praying that whoever left those footprints was still alive. By midday, the team had found signs that someone had recently used the area. Pieces of broken branches, faint paths through the grass, a small handmade tool left behind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove someone had been surviving out there. When the news reached him, the pilot's throat tightened. The light he'd seen, the reflection, it wasn't an accident. Someone had been signaling, desperate to be found. The following days blurred together in a mix of hope and exhaustion. The rescue mission grew larger, with drones and dogs joining the search. Reporters started to gather outside the base, sensing a story that touched both tragedy and miracle. But the pilot didn't care about cameras or credit. He only cared about finding the person behind that signal. Each night, as he returned to his small hotel room, he'd write in his notebook, the same one where he had first jotted those coordinates weeks ago. He'd record every update, every discovery, every emotion. It was his way of making sense of it all. "I saw the light for a reason," he whispered one night before falling asleep. He didn't know yet what that reason was, but deep down he believed that this story wasn't over. Somewhere in those mountains, life was still waiting to be found. The rescue team continued their search for days, climbing through thick forests and crossing freezing streams. The terrain was wild and unforgiving, full of cliffs and fallen trees that had stood untouched for years. But this time the mission had direction. They had the coordinates the pilot had given them, and the clear sign of footprints that suggested someone might still be alive. That small piece of hope kept everyone moving, even when exhaustion started to show on their faces. The pilot stayed close to the base camp, helping in any way he could. He wasn't officially part of the rescue team, but no one stopped him. He helped carry supplies, studied the maps, and offered advice from his flight experience about the terrain's shape from above. Every morning he would walk to the edge of the camp and look toward the mountains, quietly wondering if the person they were searching for was watching from somewhere out there, waiting to be found. On the third day, a rescue helicopter flew low over the valley and spotted something unusual, a small clearing with traces of smoke. It wasn't a campfire, just a dark patch where something had burned recently. That was enough to bring fresh energy to the team. They marked the area and began their hike at dawn the next day. The pilot asked to go along, but the team leader shook his head. "It's too rough up there," he said. "We'll update you from the radio." The pilot nodded, understanding, though his heart sank. It was hard to just wait while others searched for answers he had started looking for. Hours passed slowly. The wind picked up and clouds gathered again, threatening to bring rain. The radio crackled with updates, nothing yet, just dense forest and uneven ground. Then sometime after noon, the signal came through again. The team had found something. "Looks like a handmade shelter," one of them said over the radio. "Small, made of branches and sheets of metal. Someone's been living here." The pilot froze, gripping the radio tightly. He could hear the faint voices of excitement and disbelief in the background. They described the shelter, simple, rough, but built with purpose. Inside they found a few empty cans, a water bottle, and some torn fabric that looked like clothing. There were also small carvings on the wooden walls, lines and marks, maybe to count days or months. Then came the words that made everyone stop breathing for a moment. "We found her." The voice on the radio was trembling. A young woman, alive. The camp around the pilot erupted with movement. People ran toward the communication tent, trying to listen. The pilot's hands shook as he pressed the radio closer, his heart pounding faster than ever. He could barely believe what he had just heard. After all these weeks, after all those flights and sleepless nights, there really was someone alive out there. The next few hours felt endless as the rescue team worked to bring her down safely. The path was steep and she was weak, barely able to walk. They had to carry her part of the way, wrapping her in blankets and keeping her hydrated. The pilot watched the helicopter return through the fog, his breath caught in his chest. When it landed, everyone gathered around, quiet and respectful. The young woman was pale, her hair tangled, her face thin but calm. Her eyes blinked against the sudden light. She looked around slowly, confused, as rescuers spoke softly to her. She didn't say much at first, only whispered for water. The pilot stood a few steps away, not wanting to crowd her, but he couldn't look away. This was the person he had unknowingly seen from thousands of feet above. The signal that had changed everything had come from her. Later, when doctors checked her in the field tent, they confirmed that she was the missing daughter from the newspaper story. The same family that had vanished months ago. The realization spread through the camp like electricity. No one could understand how she had survived for so long. As the sun began to set, she slowly began to speak. Her voice was faint, but everyone leaned in to listen. She told them that their car had slipped off a narrow road during a storm. Her parents hadn't survived the crash, and for days she had stayed near the wreck, too injured and scared to move. When help never came, she gathered what she could: blankets, food, a mirror from the car, and started walking. She found a cave first, then built a small shelter from broken branches and metal scraps. She had lived off rainwater and wild berries. Sometimes she would see planes fly overhead, but none ever noticed her. The mirror became her only way of signaling. Every time the sun shone through the clouds, she would stand outside and flash it toward the sky, praying someone might see it. Her voice cracked when she said, "I didn't think anyone ever would." The pilot's eyes filled with tears as he listened. It was his light. The one he couldn't forget. The reason he couldn't sleep. He realized then that his decision to follow that instinct had saved her life. It didn't feel real, just a moment of fate that had finally found its way. After she finished speaking, she asked one question that silenced the entire camp. "Did you find my parents?" The team members exchanged quiet glances before one of them gently nodded. Her lips trembled and she turned her face away, tears slipping down her cheeks. No one spoke for a while. Even the wind seemed to quiet down, as if nature itself was listening. The pilot wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. Instead, he just stood nearby, silent, his heart heavy yet full of respect. She had survived through unimaginable strength, and now her story would live on. Later that night, as she rested in a hospital bed after being airlifted out, the pilot sat outside in the waiting area, staring at the dark window. Reporters were already calling it a miracle, but he didn't think of it that way. To him, it was something deeper, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how one person's small choice could change everything. He thought about how close it all had come to being missed. If he hadn't looked down at that exact moment, if the light hadn't flickered just then, she might never have been found. That thought both haunted and humbled him. The next day, when he finally saw her again in the hospital, she smiled faintly and said, "You saw me." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she reached out her weak hand and said softly, "Thank you for not ignoring it." He smiled back, his voice low. "It wasn't me. It was you. You never gave up." Her eyes filled again and she squeezed his hand gently. "I didn't know if anyone would ever see me," she whispered. "But I kept trying." The pilot left the hospital that evening feeling changed. For years he had flown thousands of flights, all blending together into routine. But now he knew that even the smallest detail, a flash of light, could carry the weight of someone's life. He realized that being a pilot wasn't just about flying planes. It was about paying attention to the world below, to the people who might be silently asking for help. As he walked to his car, the sunset painted the sky orange and pink. He paused and looked up one last time. Somewhere beyond those clouds, he remembered the exact spot where he had first seen that flicker. The mountains stood there still, strong and silent. But now they held a story of survival, hope, and connection. A story that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The young woman's rescue became the kind of story that spread quickly across towns and newsrooms. Everyone wanted to know how she had managed to survive for so long, how she had built a life out of almost nothing in such a dangerous and lonely place. But while people outside were fascinated by the miracle, inside the hospital things were quiet and emotional. For her, every breath was still heavy, every sound still strange after months of hearing only the wind, birds, and her own voice echoing in the woods. The pilot visited often. At first he didn't say much. He would bring small things, flowers, fruit, or sometimes a magazine she could flip through when she couldn't sleep. He didn't go there for thanks. He just wanted to see her getting better, to make sure the light he saw that day really did lead to life. One afternoon, as he walked into the hospital room, she was sitting by the window, staring at the sky. Her face was thin but softer now, her skin no longer as pale. When she noticed him, she smiled faintly. "You still look at the sky like it's talking to you," she said. He laughed quietly. "Maybe it does. It's where I spend most of my life." She looked out again. "I used to do that too before everything. I thought the sky was just beautiful. Now I look at it and think, it saved me." Those words stayed with him. He sat beside her, and for the first time she began to talk freely. She told him about the nights she spent in the cold, lighting small fires to keep animals away, about how she would listen for engines in the sky and run to the clearing with her mirror, hoping someone might notice the flashes. "Some days," she said, "I thought I was just sending light into nothing. But I kept doing it because it made me feel like I was still part of the world." The pilot nodded, his eyes glistening. "You were," he said softly. "You never disappeared. You just waited for someone to see you." Over the following weeks, she started to recover. Her strength slowly returned. She could walk short distances around the hospital and even started helping nurses fold small pieces of linen. The doctors said her recovery was a miracle, but it wasn't just her body that needed healing. Her heart carried years of silence, grief, and loneliness. There were nights when she would wake up crying quietly, missing her parents, feeling the ache of everything she had lost. The pilot often stayed late, just sitting nearby so she wouldn't feel alone. Sometimes they didn't even speak, they just shared the quiet. It was enough. He never asked too many questions about what she had gone through. He understood that some pain needed time before it could be spoken aloud. One evening, when the sun was setting and the room was filled with soft orange light, she said, "You know, I used to imagine what I'd say if someone ever found me. I had this whole speech planned in my head." She smiled sadly. "But when I saw the rescue team, I couldn't say a word. I just cried." "You don't have to say anything," the pilot said gently. "You did everything right. You survived. That's all that matters." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "It's strange. For so long I thought I was forgotten. Then I find out someone saw my light from so far away. It makes me think maybe people are connected in ways we don't understand." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes all it takes is one person to notice something others overlook." As she grew stronger, visitors came and went. Reporters, relatives, people from her town. Everyone called her a miracle. But she never liked that word. She said she didn't feel like one. She just did what she had to do to stay alive. Yet she knew that without the pilot, she would never have been found. When she told him that, he smiled and said, "It wasn't just me. You kept sending the signal. You believed someone would see it. That's what saved you." Months passed. She was finally released from the hospital, and the community held a small gathering to celebrate her recovery. The pilot attended quietly, standing at the back of the crowd. He watched as she spoke, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. "I learned something up there in those mountains," she said. "Hope doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's just a small flicker that refuses to die, and sometimes that's enough for the right person to see." The crowd applauded, and for a moment the pilot felt something warm rise in his chest, a mix of pride and peace. After the event, she found him standing near the parking lot, away from the noise. She smiled and said, "I saw you hiding in the back." "I wasn't hiding," he said with a grin. "Just watching," she laughed softly. "You don't like attention, do you?" He shook his head. "Not really. I like quiet places. The sky gives me enough noise." Her face turned serious for a moment. "You gave me my life back," she said. "How do I thank someone for that?" "You already did," he said simply. "By living." That night when he drove home, the streets looked different. The world felt quieter, lighter somehow. He realized that what he had done wasn't something extraordinary. It was just an act of listening to his heart. But sometimes that's all it takes to make a miracle happen. In the following months, she began a small project with the help of the local rescue organization. Her goal was to help others who went missing in remote places, to make sure no one would ever feel as forgotten as she once did. She worked with pilots, volunteers, and rescue teams, creating awareness about the importance of search coordination and aerial spotting. The pilot joined her efforts, helping train young aviators to recognize unusual signals from the ground. He would tell them, "Never ignore something that catches your eye. Sometimes it's more than just light. Sometimes it's a person's last hope." Working together gave them both purpose. For her, it was healing. For him, it was a reminder of why he loved flying. It wasn't just about planes and skies, it was about connection, about being a small bridge between life and loss. One cold morning, about a year later, she invited him to visit the area where the crash had happened. The road had been cleared by now, and a small memorial stood beside the forest. It was simple, a wooden cross, a few flowers, and a sign that read, "Never stop sending your light." She stood quietly beside it, her eyes wet but calm. "I come here sometimes," she said softly. "Not to cry anymore, but to remember that even the darkest places can hold light." The pilot looked at the forest, still dense and quiet. The air carried the smell of pine and wet soil. "It's peaceful here," he said, "almost like the mountains wanted to keep the secret until it was time." She smiled faintly. Maybe they did. Maybe everything has its time. They stood there for a long while, saying nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. Then, as they turned to leave, she stopped and looked up at the sky. "I still look for planes," she said. "It's a habit I don't think I'll ever lose," he smiled. "Good. You never know who might be looking back." As they drove away, the sun began to set behind the hills. The same light that once flashed from her mirror now painted the world in gold. The pilot glanced up through the windshield and whispered quietly, "You were right. Hope doesn't shout. It shines. In that quiet moment, both of them knew their lives would never be the same again. The world was still full of noise and rushing people, but they had learned something few ever do. That sometimes the smallest sign can lead to the biggest miracle. And when someone chooses to see it, to act on it, that simple act of noticing can change not just one life, but two. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the steady rhythm of the girl's breathing. Days had passed since she was brought down from the mountains, but it still didn't feel real to her. She had spent years alone with only the wind and her memories as company. Now there were voices, footsteps, people who smiled when they saw her awake. Each time a nurse came in to check on her, she would say thank you as if still afraid it might all disappear. When the pilot finally came to see her, she didn't recognize him at first. He stood by the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking unsure whether he should enter. The nurse smiled and told her softly, "That's the man who found you." She turned her head and their eyes met for the first time. For a long moment neither of them spoke. He walked closer, a little nervous, his voice low and gentle when he said, "I'm glad you're safe." She could barely hold back her tears. "You saw me," she whispered. "No one else ever did." He nodded slowly. "Something told me not to forget that light," he said. "I couldn't let it go." They talked for hours that day. She told him about her parents, about how they had laughed and sung in the car before the accident. She remembered the cold, the silence after the crash, and how she had called out for days until her voice faded. The pilot listened quietly, never interrupting. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. He just let her speak. She told him how she survived, how she collected rainwater, learned to catch fish with her hands, and built a small shelter out of fallen branches. "Every time I saw a plane," she said softly, "I would run to the clearing and wave a mirror I made from an old piece of metal. Sometimes I thought they saw me, but they never came. Until you did." He lowered his head, his voice thick. "I'm sorry it took so long." She smiled faintly. "You still came. That's what matters." In the weeks that followed, she began to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. The hospital staff grew fond of her gentle nature and her quiet strength. Reporters tried to speak to her, but she asked for privacy. She didn't want her pain turned into a story for headlines. Still, the story spread on its own. People called it a miracle in the mountains. The pilot avoided interviews too. When asked why he went looking again after so many months, he simply said, "Because something in my heart told me to." It was all he needed to say. One afternoon, when the hospital garden was filled with sunlight, she asked if he would walk with her outside. She was still weak, but she wanted to feel the air again. They walked slowly side by side past the flowers and trees. She looked up at the sky and said, "You must see this view every day up there." He smiled. "I do, but it's different now." "How so?" "Before I just saw clouds and light. Now every time I look down, I wonder who might be waiting for help, who might need someone to notice." Her eyes softened. "You changed how I see the sky too," she said. "For so long I looked up and hoped someone would see me. Now when I look up, I feel seen." Months later, she was strong enough to leave the hospital. She didn't have any relatives left, but she didn't want to disappear again. Instead, she wanted to do something that would help others who might one day be lost and waiting for rescue. With the pilot's encouragement, she started a small foundation that worked with mountain rescue teams. Their goal was simple: to help improve aerial search systems so no signal would ever go unnoticed again. The pilot became one of the foundation's first supporters. He offered his time and knowledge, teaching young pilots how to recognize distress signals from above. During his talks, he would often say, "Sometimes saving a life doesn't begin with skill. It begins with not ignoring what your heart is trying to tell you." Their bond grew stronger over time. They weren't just survivor and rescuer anymore. They were two people connected by a story that had changed both their lives. She often said that he gave her a second life, but he always corrected her. "You gave yourself that life," he would reply. "I just followed the light." A year later, she visited the mountain site one last time, accompanied by the pilot and the rescue team. They placed flowers near the spot where her parents' car had been found. She knelt there quietly for a long time, her fingers touching the cool ground. "They would have thanked you," she said softly, turning to the pilot. He shook his head gently. "They're the reason I saw the light. Maybe they were guiding me too." They stood there together, the wind brushing through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine. The mountains looked peaceful that day, almost as if they remembered her story and were finally at rest. As they prepared to leave, she turned back one more time. "I used to think the mountains took everything from me," she said. "But now I know they gave me something too. They gave me you." The pilot didn't reply right away. He simply smiled and placed a hand over his heart, a quiet gesture that said more than words could. Back in the city, the foundation continued to grow. Pilots from different airlines joined their awareness program. Search technology improved, and every year, lives were saved because of what started with one man's decision not to ignore a feeling. On the first anniversary of her rescue, the foundation organized a small ceremony. There was no media, just a few close people, rescuers, pilots, and volunteers. She stood at the front and said in a trembling voice, "I spent years waiting for someone to find me. Now I want to spend the rest of my life helping others be found." After the applause faded, she looked toward the pilot sitting quietly in the back row. Their eyes met again and she smiled. That silent connection, built from courage, loss, and faith, would stay with them forever. Later, he returned to flying. Every time his plane passed over a mountain range, he would glance out the window, remembering that one day when everything changed. He would whisper softly, "I see you," as if speaking to every person waiting for hope below. Once, during a quiet evening flight, he caught a faint reflection on the ground far below, just sunlight hitting water this time. But it made him smile anyway. He knew that sometimes even the smallest light could mean someone's life. He landed that night with a peaceful heart. The world could be unpredictable and full of pain, but it could also be filled with miracles, the kind that come when someone simply refuses to look away. And so, the man who once saw a faint flash in the forest learned that it wasn't just a signal from the ground. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, a small light can lead the way home.